Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about when does it matter to have an expensive camera? Can you get away with lower budget cameras today as they're getting better and better and better? Or does it actually make a difference to have a more expensive cinema camera? For me, I own the red KOMODO, which is a cinema camera. Red Digital Cinema is known for, their cameras are used in Hollywood movies, in, TV shows. They're a very, very high caliber camera. I have the KOMODO, which is probably, the cheapest out of their cameras because they can get quite expensive. But that camera being the cheapest option is still, a 8 grand Canadian camera. And then you build it out with accessories on top of that. And so, it gets expensive to own these high quality cameras, and is it worth it? Are you really getting, the added image quality out of that, or can you get away with something cheaper than that? Can you get away with a DSLR or an iPhone or what have you? And so I want to go through a couple of factors in that today. What scenarios, another camera might cut it, what scenarios it won't. And so first off, I want to talk about lighting. Lighting should always come first. Whether you're using an iPhone, a DSLR, or a cinema camera, the bottom line really does come down to lighting as to whether the image looks good or not. I hear people get into, these debates about which camera is better and these features like low light and resolution and dynamic range and all of these things. And all of those are really helpful features to have in a camera. But if you don't have the fundamentals first, your image isn't going to look good. And so to illustrate that, I'll just show kind of an example right now. So let's show an image with, this is my GH5 that I have, which has substantially lower dynamic range. It's not a cinema camera. Its color science is not nearly as good as the red KOMODO. But here's what the GH5 looks like when you actually light a scene. And then here's an example of the KOMODO, which is a cinema camera. It has a high dynamic range. It has a 6K resolution. It has, all the bells and whistles, but the scene is not lit. And so you can see the difference. It's pretty huge. Light is a huge factor. Yes, a camera can do a better job of interpreting and capturing the image that is in front of it. But if the image in front of it is not a good one to begin with, the camera's just gonna be amplifying garbage, right? Garbage in, garbage out, the classic saying. And so you want to make sure that you have your fundamentals down first. And yes, having a higher dynamic range can help you from, blowing out your highlights or clipping your shadows, but it can't change the direction of light. It can't change the quality of light. It can't change, the softness of light, the harshness of light, any of those things. And so you as a cinematographer, you as a filmmaker need to put those elements in place so that the camera can capture those the best that it can. The way that I would put it is that a good camera is the cherry on top. There's so many other stages in the, film or the cinematography process before the camera, but the camera is the thing that, brings all that hard work together at the very end. And so, things like composition, things like blocking, things like, lens choice, things like bokeh and your background, things like direction of light, making sure that the quality, like the color of the light is quite high, making sure that it's accurate, making sure that the softness of light and the bounce and the fill is balanced to taste. All of those things contribute more to the image than simply having, say, a high dynamic range or a resolution that is higher than another. These factors you need to have all these factors in place, and then the camera will really bring it all together in the end. So does that mean that anyone with an iPhone can get great looking cinematic images? Well, yes and no, because though there's all these other pieces before the camera that make a good looking image, the camera does matter as well. There are there's ways of processing the image inside of a camera, or just specs of capturing an image that will be different from, say, a cinema camera to an iPhone. And there's certain things that you can get pretty close with, but there's certain things that just are different. And so a couple of those things is, with an iPhone, the resolution is not going to be the same as a cinema camera. And what I mean by that is, yes, iPhones, yes, they can shoot 4K these days and they have pretty good specs on them. But just because the numbers are the same, like just because you have a 4K resolution on an iPhone and a 4K resolution on a camera, doesn't actually mean that those are equal. If you know the company ARRI, which makes incredible cinema cameras, you might be interested to know that a lot of their cameras only shoot 1080p. But when you watch it in theaters, it looks like 4K. It looks like great 4K, but it's not, it's 1080. And that's because resolution, it's not just the number of pixels, but it's the quality of pixels. And in an iPhone, the quality of pixels is quite low. Yes, they have a high pixel count, but those pixels aren't very good. But when it comes to cinema cameras, even if you have a 1080 resolution or only have a 4K resolution on an 8K resolution or what have you, those resolutions are built out of really, really high quality and well captured pixels. And so that makes a huge difference. When you blow up that image, you can tell the difference. It's not, you know, 4K iPhone footage and 4K Red Komodo footage looks the same. It doesn't. And so that is something to consider. Another piece is dynamic range. When an iPhone captures a photo or a video now, a lot of the time it's capturing it in HDR, which to the eye, it looks pretty good. Like we say that iPhones have come a pretty long way because you look at, you know, an iPhone photo and you're like, wow, you know, the clouds aren't blown out and my face isn't, you know, underexposed and it looks pretty good. And it does. But that's all in processing. The camera hasn't actually captured that level of, you know, dynamic range. It can't actually see the clouds and the shadows. What it's doing is it's taking two photos and stitching it together. It's basically capturing two different exposures and then artificially stitching it together. And it's using its own calculations and algorithms to basically tell it how to do that. The issue with that is, one, it's not actually capturing that information. And so it's very hard. If you were to take that into post and try to, you know, control that and manipulate it, it would fall apart a lot quicker than if you had a higher dynamic range and you actually captured that information. Two, how it processes it isn't always right. Sometimes you'll get these weird glitchy parts in the image where you have the HDR kicking in on a section of the image and then a section where it doesn't kick in. And that's an issue. And if you're into photography, you'd know that if you take HDR photos, you don't have the camera stitch it together on its own. You want to be able to control that. And so you'll actually capture two different exposures and then put that together in post and make those calls as to where you want that HDR or that different exposure to kick in and where you don't want it to affect parts of the image. And so though iPhones can do a pretty good job and it looks pretty decent, right? You know, as soon as you snap the photo, it looks pretty good. Or as soon as you capture the video, it looks pretty good. You don't actually have all that information to work with. And so if you're to do post-production on that footage, it wouldn't work very well. If you're to, you know, if you wanted to adjust some of the artificial steps that it's taken in adding HDR, or, you know, when you are in portrait mode and it artificially blurs out the background, if you're wanting to control those things in post, you can't. It's baked in. It's already done that processing and you don't get that raw data anymore. In addition to that, though iPhones are coming out with, you know, these accessories for different, you know, lens choices, some iPhones even have, you know, different lenses built into them that you can choose from. The reality is that you don't have the same lens choice or quality that you would get when you're using a cinema camera or DSLR. You don't have access to cinema glass. You don't have access to even really high-end photography glass. That's just not the case. And you also don't have manual focus with these lenses. It's completely autofocus for video and photo when you're shooting on an iPhone, and that's a problem. Computers and algorithms, they make mistakes. It's not going to nail what you want it to do 100% of the time. And so it's very hard to get the next level of, you know, it's very hard to get it to pull focus the way that you want it to. It's very hard for it to always be on the subject that you want it to be on, especially if you have things moving in the shot or the camera itself is moving. It's not always going to do what you have in mind. It's not going to be able to read your mind. The only way to do that is for you to manually control that setting. Cinema cameras, in comparison to an iPhone or even a lot of DSLRs, are different in the sense that a lot of cinema cameras can shoot RAW, which just opens up a whole other world of post-production. Being able to shoot RAW allows you to control your ISO, your white balance, sometimes even your highlight roll-off. It just enables you to change these things after the fact that usually would be baked into your camera footage and you wouldn't be able to get back after the fact, after you press record and offloaded your footage. But with RAW, you have access to these settings still. And that's huge. Like if you shoot a image and it's underexposed, just bringing up the exposure slider is going to bring in a lot of noise. It's going to start to break that image apart. But if you just change the ISO on raw footage, it's non-destructive. And so when you're starting to get into higher quality shoots, higher quality deliverables, this does matter. And that's not, if you're shooting a, little video for Facebook, maybe it doesn't, right? Like maybe an iPhone is good enough. But if you're shooting something for, broadcast, if you're shooting something for, to be shown in a movie theater, like that, those need to be at a certain standard. And so it's not necessarily good enough to shoot on these lower caliber image capturing devices like an iPhone or a DSLR. You need to have guarantee that that footage will turn out well and up to a certain quality and standard. A cinema camera that has a high quality dynamic range and resolution and color science is going to make it a lot easier and more forgiving to capture footage in non-ideal situations. And so I think that's something that is a contributing factor. Okay, if you can control all the elements, if you can control your lighting and your background and all these different things, then using an iPhone becomes a lot more tangible, right? Like if you can control all the variables that go into the camera, then it's easy to manipulate those and change those in a way that then will look good to the specific camera that you're using. But if you don't have control of those variables, then you're just dealt what you're dealt. And so having a cinema camera that is better equipped to handle those environments is obviously going to produce better quality image. For instance, if you're in harsh sunlight, or if you have sunlight that's coming from a strange direction, if you don't have the luxury of being able to backlight your subjects and have their face more in shadow, but instead you have really harsh sun coming directly onto their face. Well, shooting it with an iPhone or a DSLR with a lower dynamic range versus a cinema camera that has a high dynamic range, that's gonna make a huge difference, because that contrast between the highlights and the shadows on their face are gonna become even more drastic on those lower quality cameras. And so it's gonna start to look really bad. But if you have a cinema camera, something with a higher dynamic range, then it's not gonna look so bad. That contrast ratio is gonna be lower on their face, and the roll off of it is gonna look more natural. The way that it handles the skin tones in those harsh environments is gonna look more natural. And so if you aren't able to control the outcome, the camera you have starts to matter more and more. And then when you can control the environment, it just elevates it and takes that image to the next level. If I shot something on my GH5 and had it lit, it would look good. But if I shot it on my red Komodo, it would look great. And that's the difference. And it really comes down to knowing what your application is and whether it's worth it for your particular scenario or not. There is a difference. One is higher quality than the other. One will achieve better results than the other. But that doesn't mean that you can't get good results on something that's lower quality, and that's okay. You can be okay with only good results and not great results, and that for a lot of people that will be more than enough. And so you just really need to evaluate the situation. What kind of budget do you have? What kind of resources do you have available to you? What kind of deliverable is it? Will your client care? Do you care? And these are all factors that you need to consider for yourself. And a big thing too is just knowing the limitations of your gear, and that will help you to produce the best images. If you're shooting on a DSLR that only has 8 stops of dynamic range, just know that you can't push it in really harsh conditions. You need to find times where you have overcast days or shade, or scenarios where you can flag off and control lighting. Just know what what you're able to work within. If you're shooting on an iPhone, know that your depth of field isn't going to be that great, and so you just need to compensate for what your gear, what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are, and it's your job to know that as a filmmaker, as a videographer, and to be able to work within that and be able to point your clients in a direction that works within the gear that you have. And will produce the best results with what you currently own. And so anyway, that's what I have for you. That's it for me today. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of perspective on, is it worth it upgrading cameras? It's not always worth it, but sometimes it is. And you need to evaluate that for yourself, what level of work you're doing, what kind of clients you're working with, what your deliverables are. Just take the time to think that over, evaluate that, and then make a decision that's financially based. Will getting that gear bring more money in? At the end of the day, if this is something that you make money off of, you're operating a business, right? And so you need to make a fiscally responsible decision, one that is an investment and not just a new piece of gear that's a toy and is fun for you. Though that can be fun as well if you have the money to spare. So anyway, that's it for me. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Give it a like if you did, subscribe to this channel, and I will see you in the next one.